The relay station at Kesari Drift had been silent for 900 years, and the first sign that something was wrong was that it began to sing. Not loudly, not in any way the instruments could explain. The maintenance crew, 3 Thuln technicians on a routine isotope swap, noticed it as a vibration in the floor plating, a low harmonic that rose and fell like breathing. They checked the reactors. They checked the gravitic dampeners. They checked, finally, the ancient sensor array that pointed outward into the dead lane of the void corridor, the stretch of empty space that no ship had crossed in living memory, because there was nothing on the other side worth the fuel. There was a ship in the corridor now. It was small. That was the first thing the senior technician, Alan Vec, logged in his report, and it was the detail that would later be read aloud in 17 separate inquiry chambers across 4 civilizations, because it was so wrong. The ship was small. It was the size of a single cargo hauler, scarred and asymmetrical, trailing a faint plume of vented atmosphere like a wound that had never finished closing. It was not a warship. It carried no recognizable weapon signature. By every metric the Thuln used to measure threat, it was nothing, a piece of debris with an engine. And the station was singing because the ship was broadcasting. Alan Vec would spend the rest of his life trying to describe the sound to people who had not heard it. It was not a distress signal. The Thuln knew distress signals. They were standardized, mathematical, designed to be understood across every species that had ever touched the common lanes. This was something else. It was a recording of voices, organic voices, layered hundreds deep, overlapping, some of them clearly children, some of them clearly old, some of them clearly in the act of dying. And the recording had been compressed and folded and repeated until it became a single sustained tone that the station's hull translated into that low, breathing hum. The technicians did not know what it meant. They sent the signal up the chain to the regional listening post, which sent it to the conquered analytical authority, which fed it into the oldest and most trusted interpretive engines in the galaxy. And the engines, which had successfully decoded every language the conquered had ever encountered, returned a result that no one knew how to file. The signal was not a language. It was a memory, and it had been built, deliberately, to be impossible to forget. That was the first mystery, and by the time anyone understood it, 3 civilizations would already have made decisions they could not take back. The ship was called, according to its own hull markings, the Margaret Whitfield Carries Us Home, and there was exactly one living thing aboard it. Her name was Anna Reyes, and she was 41 years old, and she had not spoken to another living person in 206 days. She knew this because she counted. She counted everything now: the days, the ration packets, the number of times the hull groaned, the number of names on the wall behind her pilot's chair, which she had written in grease pencil because the ship's logging system had failed in the 3rd month, and she did not trust her own memory anymore. There were 411 names on the wall. She had written every one of them herself. She knew what each of them sounded like when they laughed. She did not know that the galaxy had started to panic. She did not know that anything was out here at all. The corridor was supposed to be empty. That was the entire point of the corridor. When her ship had limped into it, she had wept, because empty space was the first thing in 200 days that hadn't been actively trying to kill her, and she had set the broadcast to repeat and curled up in the pilot's chair and slept for 19 hours straight. And she had no idea that her sleep was, at that very moment, being studied by minds older than her species. The conquered did not contact her. This was the second decision that could not be taken back, and it was made for a reason that seemed, at the time, entirely rational. The conquered did not contact her because they were afraid of what she was. To understand the fear, you have to understand what the Thuln analysts saw when they finally cracked the structure of the signal. It was not just a memory. It was a memory that had been engineered for transmission, folded, compressed, optimized, which meant that whoever built it had wanted it to travel, had wanted it to be heard, had spent the kind of effort on its construction that a civilization only spends on something it considers more important than survival. And the analysts, working backward from the compression artifacts, reached a conclusion that made the senior coordinator of the analytical authority sit very still for a long time. The signal had been built by hundreds of people. The 411 voices were not random. They had each contributed, deliberately, knowingly, in sequence. And the sequence ended. The voices simply stopped, one by one, in an order, and the last voice in the recording was a single human female saying 6 words that the engines translated with a confidence rating of 91%. "We are the ones who stayed." The coordinator did not know what they had stayed for. But she understood, with the cold certainty of someone who has spent her life reading the shapes of dead things, that 410 of those voices were no longer alive, and that the survivor was flying their memory across the galaxy in a broken ship, and that this was not the behavior of a species that could be reasoned with using any of the tools the conquered possessed. So they watched. They sent observation drones, cloaked, careful, keeping their distance. And they began, quietly, to evacuate the 3 nearest systems. This is the part of the story where you must understand the conquered, because everything that follows is the story of the conquered being wrong, in escalating and increasingly catastrophic ways, about the woman in the broken ship. The conquered was old. It had survived for 60,000 years by following a single principle, which was that any species that behaved irrationally was a species that could not be predicted, and any species that could not be predicted was a threat that had to be contained before it understood its own strength. They had done this many times. There was a procedure. It worked. It had always worked. The procedure assumed that every species at its core wanted to live. That when faced with annihilation, it would calculate the cost and choose survival, because survival was the foundation on which all other values rested. You could predict a species if you knew what it was unwilling to lose. The humans did not fit the procedure, and the first sign of this was the thing the drones recorded on the 8th day. Anna Reyes was dying. The drones could see it. Her ship's life support was failing in stages. The carbon scrubbers were saturated. The water reclamation was throwing errors she had stopped trying to fix, and her body, when the drones imaged it through the hull, showed the unmistakable signatures of slow starvation and oxygen deprivation. She had perhaps 30 days. The conquered analysts ran the projection forward and concluded that within the month, the human threat would resolve itself without any intervention at all. The ship would become a tomb. The signal would stop. The procedure recommended patience. And then Anna Reyes did something that the analysts could not explain, and that they would spend the next several weeks arguing about, and that would eventually be understood as the first true glimpse of what they were actually dealing with. She started repairing the ship, not to survive. That was what confused them. The repairs she made did nothing to extend her own life. She stripped the medical bay, the part of the ship designed to keep her alive, and used its components to reinforce the broadcast array. She was reallocating her remaining time away from her own survival and toward making the signal louder. She was, in the cold mathematics of the conquered, choosing to die faster in order to be heard farther. No species did this. The procedure had no entry for this. A junior analyst, a Velith named Sara, who would become more important to this story than anyone could have predicted, filed a dissenting note that her superiors ignored. The note said, "We have been asking what the humans are unwilling to lose. We may be asking the wrong question. We may need to ask what they are willing to lose and find that the answer is everything." The note was archived. It would be read again, much later, by people who wished they had read it sooner. Anna did not know she was being watched, but she had begun to suspect she was not as alone as she believed. It started as a feeling, the kind she had learned not to dismiss in the long dark after the others died, a wrongness in the readings. The Whitfield sensors were old and half-broken, but she had flown them long enough to know their lies, and lately the lies had taken on a pattern. There was a shadow that moved when she wasn't looking at it, a heat signature that vanished when she turned the array toward it. She had spent enough time alone to know what loneliness did to a mind, and she cataloged the possibility that she was hallucinating with the same flat honesty she applied to everything now. But she didn't believe it. The shadow was too disciplined. Hallucinations didn't hide. So on the 11th day, with hands that shook from hunger, she did something the conquered drones had not anticipated. She turned off the broadcast. For the first time in 217 days, the Margaret Whitfield Carries Us Home went silent. The effect on the conquered was immediate and disproportionate to anything the silence should have caused. The observation network, which had been calibrated entirely around the signal, lost its anchor. Drones that had been triangulating off the broadcast suddenly had nothing to triangulate. And in that silence, for 9 full minutes, the most advanced surveillance apparatus in the galaxy lost track of a single dying human in a broken ship. When they reacquired her, the ship had moved. Not far. But it had moved in a direction the analysts had not predicted, on a vector that made no sense for a vessel trying to reach safe harbor. And Anna Reyes was sitting in her pilot's chair looking directly into the lens of the nearest cloaked drone, which was, by every specification the Conquered trusted, completely invisible. She could not see it. That was certain. The technology was sound. It had hidden Conquered observers from far more sophisticated sensors than a half-dead cargo hauler, And yet she was looking at it. Not near it, at it. And she raised one hand slowly and pressed it flat against the inside of the viewport, palm out, in a gesture the analysts ran through every cultural database they had and could not classify. Sara, the junior Velith analyst, classified it in her private notes with a single word that her species did not have a precise equivalent for and that she had to borrow from the human signal itself. Greeting. She did not turn the broadcast back on. That was the part that frightened the coordinator most when the report reached her. The human had revealed that she knew she was being watched, had made contact, and then had chosen to remain silent, which meant the silence was now a message too, and the Conquered had no idea what it said. They decided to make contact. This was the third decision that could not be taken back, and unlike the first two, it was made out of fear rather than caution, which is always the worst foundation. They did not send a person. They sent a transmission in the standardized Conquered contact protocol, broadcast on every frequency the human ship might receive, carrying the message that had successfully opened relations with 206 species across 60,000 years. Translated into the human signal's own structure, it said, in essence, "We see you. You are not alone. Tell us what you need and we will provide it in exchange for your compliance with the following terms." The terms followed. They were generous. The Conquered was not cruel. Cruelty was inefficient. They offered Anna Reyes rescue, medical care, food, repair of her vessel, and safe passage, in exchange for the deactivation of her broadcast, the surrender of the ship's records, and her agreement to be relocated to a quarantine system where her species' behavior could be studied at leisure. It was, by the standards of the Conquered, an act of profound mercy. They were offering a dying woman her life. Anna Reyes listened to the entire message. The drones recorded her face as she did, and then she laughed. It was not a laugh of joy. The analysts replayed it 400 times and never agreed on what it was. It started small and grew, and her thin shoulders shook, and tears ran down her starved face, and she laughed until she had to brace herself against the console. And the sound of it, when the engines tried to parse it for emotional content, broke the classification system entirely, because it registered simultaneously as grief and triumph and contempt, and something the Velith would later call the laughter of a person who has already paid a price so large that your threats are funny. When she stopped, she turned the broadcast back on, but she had changed it. She had added her own voice to the recording. One more name appended to the end, after we are the ones who stayed. And the engines translated her addition, and the coordinator of the analytical authority read the translation, and for the first time in her 400-year career, she ordered the evacuation of a system that was not in any danger, because she did not understand what was happening, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. What Anna Reyes had added was this: "You think you found me. I have been looking for you for 200 years. Now you must understand what no one in the Concord understood yet, and what Anna Reyes had not told anyone, because there was no one left to tell. The 411 names on her wall were not a crew. They were a colony. A human colony, 11,000 light years from any other human settlement, established on the edge of the void corridor for a reason that the Concord, in its 60,000 years of careful watching, had never learned. Humanity had been out here before. Not recently. Long ago in the early scattering, when the human ships went out in every direction without maps because there were no maps, and most of them died, and a few of them landed, and one of them landed on a world that should have been empty and was not. The colony had found something there, and the colony had spent 4 generations dying to keep it secret, and Anna Reyes was the last of them, and the broadcast was not a memorial. It was a warning. And it was aimed at the Concord specifically, because the colony had known the Concord was coming, because the thing they had found on that world had told them so 200 years before the Concord's drones ever arrived. But that revelation was still days away, and in the meantime the Concord made its first truly fatal mistake. They tried to take the ship by force. It was a small force. They were not afraid of the vessel itself. They were afraid of the signal and what it might be summoning, and so the operation was designed for speed. A single retrieval cruiser, a boarding team of 9, a clean extraction of one starving human who could not possibly resist. The cruiser closed the distance in 4 hours. The boarding team breached the airlock of the Margaret Whitfield Carries Us Home with the practiced ease of a species that had been doing this for longer than humanity had possessed language. And they found the ship empty, not abandoned, empty in a way that made no sense because the drones had tracked Anna Reyes continuously, had watched her never leave, had confirmed her presence in the pilot's chair 11 minutes before the breach. The boarding team moved through the vessel and found her grease pencil wall of names, and her empty ration packets counted and stacked, and her pilot's chair still warm, and no Anna Reyes anywhere aboard. The boarding team leader, a Thuln veteran named Korthan Ulu who had never failed an extraction in 200 operations, stood in the empty cockpit and felt, for the first time in his long career, the specific cold of not understanding the room he was standing in. And then his suit's proximity alert chimed, because there was a human standing directly behind him, where 11 seconds of continuous scan had shown nothing, and she was holding something against the cruiser's external hull through the open airlock, and she was smiling, and she said something that his translator caught and rendered into the common tongue with perfect clarity. She said, "I learned how to hide from you a long time ago. He taught me." And then the cruiser's reactor went dark, not destroyed. Dark. Every system aboard the Concord retrieval cruiser shut down in a single instant, not from damage, but from something the engineers would later describe with growing horror as instruction. The reactor had been told to stop, in a command language that predated the Concord, that the Concord had encountered exactly once in its history, and had spent 60,000 years pretending it had never found, and that a starving human woman should not have known, could not have known, unless someone had taught her. The boarding team was stranded. The cruiser was inert, and Anna Reyes was gone again, back into her impossible empty ship, and the broadcast continued, and now there was a new sound layered underneath it, very faint, that the engines could not parse at all because it was not a human voice, and it was not any voice the Concord had on record, and it was speaking in the command language, and it was laughing too. This was the moment the panic became real, not bureaucratic caution, real civilization-deep fear. Because the conquered had a secret, and the secret was that they were not the oldest thing in the galaxy, only the oldest thing still in charge, and they had become the oldest thing in charge by finding the previous oldest thing and destroying it, 60,000 years ago, and burying every trace of it so thoroughly that even most of the conquered did not know it had ever existed. They had not destroyed all of it. They had missed one. It had been hiding on a world at the edge of the void corridor for 60,000 years, waiting, and then the humans had landed on it. The coordinator of the analytical authority learned the truth in stages, the way you learn that a wound is mortal, first the fact of it, then the depth, then the slow understanding that nothing after this will be the same. She pulled the sealed archives. She read the records of the old war, the one the conquered did not teach. She learned what the command language was and what it could do, and why a single inert example of it had once been enough to nearly end her civilization. And she understood, finally, what the human colony had done, and her hands were not steady when she understood it. The thing on the world had been alone for 60,000 years. It could not act. It had no body, no fleet, no means. It was a mind in a buried machine, patient beyond patience, waiting for someone to find it. And the humans had found it, and it had offered them everything: knowledge, power, the command language itself, the ability to make the conquered's technology kneel. It had offered to make them the new oldest thing in charge, and the colony had said no. That was the part the coordinator read 3 times before she believed it. The colony had understood what the thing was, had understood what it offered, had understood that accepting would make them gods and refusing would make them dead, because the thing, denied, would simply wait for the next species, and the colony could not allow that. So they had done the only thing that a small, doomed, 11,000 light years from home human colony could do. They had made a deal of their own. They would not take its power for conquest. But they would take exactly enough of it to do one thing, to make sure that when the conquered came, and the thing told them the conquered would come because the conquered always came for anomalies, the conquered would be forced to listen, not to be ruled, to be warned. Because the thing on the world was not the only one of its kind still out there, and the others were waking up, and the conquered 60,000-year-old strategy of finding and burying them was about to fail, and someone had to tell them before it was too late, and the only language the conquered would not be able to ignore was the language they had spent 60,000 years pretending they had erased. The colony had spent 4 generations learning that language. It had killed them. The command language was not meant for organic minds, and it burned through them, and that was why the recording was 411 voices ending one by one, because each of them had given a piece of their mind to hold a piece of the language, and they had passed it down through their children, refining the compression, folding the warning tighter and tighter until it could fit inside a single surviving human and a single broken ship. Anna Reyes was the warning. Her body was the medium. The broadcast was not a memorial to her dead colony. It was her dead colony, 410 minds, compressed and folded and carried inside the last one, who had volunteered to be the vessel because she was the youngest and the strongest, and because someone had to live long enough to deliver it. And she had been dying not from starvation alone, but from the weight of carrying 410 people inside a single skull across 200 years of dark. When Sara, the junior Velith analyst, finally assembled this picture from the fragments, the signal structure, the command language, the sealed archives she was never supposed to access, she did not file it through normal channels. She knew it would be archived and buried like everything else. Instead, she did something that ended her career and possibly her life. She broadcast it to everyone. To every species in the conquered, on every open frequency, the whole truth. That the conquered had a secret war in its past, that the secret was waking up across the galaxy, that a single human woman was carrying the only complete warning anyone had ever managed to build, and that the Conquered's instinct, to silence her, to bury her, to treat the anomaly as a threat, was the exact instinct that had created the danger in the first place. The galaxy panicked, but it panicked now in the right direction. Anna Reyes felt it when it happened. She did not understand the politics, but she felt the shape of the attention change. The cloaked drones around her ship shifted from the cold geometry of containment to something hesitant, something almost reverent. The boarding team she had stranded was still aboard her cruiser, and she had not killed them, which the Conquered could not understand, and which Korthan Ulu the veteran would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to people who asked why the human had spared the soldiers sent to take her. The answer he gave was always the same, and it always disturbed the listener, because she was not at war with us. She was trying to save us. We were just too slow to notice. She was very close to death now. The carrying had nearly finished its work. She could feel the others in her mind growing quiet, their pieces of the language delivered now, their long task ending, and she allowed herself, for the first time in 200 days, to be afraid, not of dying, but of dying before the warning was fully understood, of having carried 410 people across the dark for nothing. And it was the thing on the world, the voice underneath the broadcast, that spoke to her then, the way it had spoken to her grandmother and her mother and to her across the long years, and it told her the truth she had been refusing to let herself know. That the warning had been received, that the Conquered had heard, that the species of the galaxy were already turning their telescopes outward toward the waking dark, that her colony's 200-year vigil was over and they had won. Not survival, never survival that had never been on offer, but the thing they had chosen instead, which was meaning. The Conquered sent one final message, not a demand this time. The coordinator herself composed it, and it was shorter than the protocols allowed, and it contained no terms. It said only, "We understand now. We are sorry. What do you need?" Anna Reyes read it. The drones recorded her face one last time. And she answered, and her answer was the thing that would be carved eventually into the foundation of the new Conquered, the one that learned to listen, the one that turned its 60,000 years of fear into 60,000 years of vigilance. She said, "Nothing. We already paid. Just don't make us have done it for nothing." And then she did the last thing, the thing the colony had designed her to do at the very end, the thing that required the full power of the command language, and that no organic mind could survive performing. She took the warning, the complete, compressed, 411-voice warning, with the location of every waking thing the buried mind had ever sensed, with the full grammar of the language the Conquered would need to fight what was coming. And she transmitted it, not as a signal that could be archived and buried, but written it directly into the substrate of Conquered space itself, into the relay network, into the listening posts, into every system that had ever carried a Conquered thought, so that it could never be erased, never be sealed, never be forgotten, because it was now part of the architecture of the galaxy's mind. It killed her. They knew it would. She knew it would. It was the last and largest sacrifice in a chain of sacrifices that had begun 200 years before she was born, and she made it the way her colony had taught her to make everything, which was completely and without surrender, and with her hand pressed flat against the viewport, palm out, in the gesture the Velith had finally learned to translate. It did not mean greeting. They had been wrong about that, the way they had been wrong about everything. It was older than greeting. It was the gesture a human makes when they are reaching toward someone they cannot touch, across a distance they cannot cross, to say the only thing that has ever mattered, which is, "I was here, and I did not look away." The Margaret Whitfield carries us home went dark and silent and still, and it drifted in the empty corridor that was no longer empty, and the Conquered did not take it. They could not. They built a cordon around it instead, and then a station, and then a memorial, and the broken cargo hauler with 411 names written in grease pencil on its wall became the most heavily guarded object in the galaxy, not because of what it could do, but because of what it had done, and what it would not let them forget. The Velith analyst Sara survived, though her career did not, and she lived long enough to see the first of the waking things contained, using the language Anna Reyes had written into the bones of the galaxy. She was asked, near the end of her life, by a young historian who had never known a Concord that was afraid of anomalies, what it had been like to be there, what the humans had taught them. She thought about it for a long time. And then she said the thing that the historian would put at the front of the record, the thing that every species in the galaxy now learned before they learned anything else about the humans, the thing that had replaced the Concord's old first principle entirely. We believed, she said, that we understood every species in the galaxy, because we understood the one thing they all shared, which was that they wanted to live, and that everything they did could be predicted from that wanting. And we were right about all of them but one. The humans wanted to live too. They wanted it desperately. The woman on that ship was as afraid to die as anything I have ever observed. But somewhere in their long climb out of the dark, they had learned a second thing, a thing we never learned in 60,000 years of survival, and it made them impossible to predict and impossible to stop and impossible in the end to do anything but love. They had learned, Sora said, that there are things worth more than continuing. And once a species knows that, once it truly knows it in its bones, in 411 voices folded into one, you cannot threaten it because you have nothing left to take. You cannot outlast it because it was never trying to last. You can only watch it walk toward the thing it has decided matters more than its own survival, and follow, and try to be worthy of what it was willing to lose. And the historian asked the question everyone always asked, the only question that remained. Were the humans the strongest species in the galaxy? And Sara, who had watched a starving woman make 60,000 years of fear kneel, who had heard 411 dead people speak as one, who had finally understood the gesture of a hand pressed to glass, gave the answer that the galaxy has never stopped repeating in the dark when the waking things stir, and the vigilance falters and someone needs to remember why they keep watch. No, she said, they were never the strongest. We could have crushed that ship in an instant, and they knew it, and it did not matter, because strength was never what we were measuring. They were the species that kept walking after the reason to walk was gone. They were the ones who stayed when staying meant dying, and who carried the dead when carrying them meant dying slower, and who reached toward us across a distance they could not cross to warn us about a danger that would not even arrive in their lifetime, and then thanked us at the end for letting their deaths mean something. We are still here because of a woman who was already dead and would not stop until we understood. And I think about her every day. I think about her hand against the glass. And I am afraid of her still, the way you are afraid of something vast and patient and kind that has looked into the dark longer than you and did not flinch. The galaxy did not panic because a human ship emerged from the void. The galaxy panicked because it finally understood what kind of thing was inside it, and what kind of thing it had almost thrown away. She is still out there in the corridor that is no longer empty, in the ship that no one will move, with 410 names beside her own, and her hand pressed forever against the glass. And every ship that passes slows and goes silent and listens, because the broadcast never stopped. It is written into the bones of everything now, too deep to erase, and on the quietest nights in the oldest systems you can still hear it, very faint, underneath all the other sounds the galaxy makes. A single human voice, folded around 400 others, saying the 6 words that ended one civilization's certainty and began another's vigilance, saying them over and over into a dark that is finally listening. We are the ones who stayed.